but the importance of climate change risk does continue to grow as a topic of discussion at board level, with investors and within our communities. In a very short space of time, climate change has found its way onto many corporate risk registers, and the introduction of TCFD and what it means to corporate Australia has also engendered greater debate and discussion by executive teams. Our speaker today is currently zooming in from my hometown of Guildford in the UK. So good morning, John. And I'd like to introduce John Scott. He is the Head of Sustainability Risk for Zurich Insurance Group, based in London, and is probably not missing the daily commute at the moment. John holds a PhD in geology and straight out of uni held senior roles with BP and BOC. He joined Zurich in 2001, becoming Head of Risk Insight in 2007, and was Chief Risk Officer for Zurich's global corporate and commercial insurance businesses for 8 years. He took on his current role in 2018, where he now leads the group's engagement on sustainability risk and is responsible for the way Zurich delivers its purpose and values. John's achievements are equally impressive. He sits on the advisory board to the World Economic Forum Global Risk Report and has contributed to every WEF Global Risk Report since 2005. He is a member of the WEF Global Future Council on Frontier Risks and on the UK Institute of Directors Sustainable Business Advisory Board. John contributes to industry and government policy on climate change and green finance through many organisations, including the Bank of England Climate Finance Risk Forum, the UK Government Green Finance Task Force, the UNEP FI Working Group on TCFD, the Geneva Association, the CRO Forum, the Net Zero Asset Owners Alliance, the European Finance Roundtable, and the list goes on. It is also my very great pleasure to congratulate John on recently joining the World Economic Forum's Global Future Council on Frontier Risks for 2020 and 2021, which is an invitation-only community comprising of experts who play an essential role in challenging assumptions, providing thought leadership, and promoting innovative thinking. On that note, it is my great pleasure to introduce John Scott to provide his insights on COVID-19 and climate change risk. Build Back Better. Thank you, John.
Thanks, Trevor. Thanks for that great introduction. A lot of acronyms there, a lot of different organisations. So good afternoon, everyone. The last session of the RIMS Australia virtual conference. So let's hope this is a good one. So what we're going to talk about today is this overview of the risks and opportunities that climate change presents to companies and governments and society at large. And as we'll see in the next half an hour or so, global risks, including those related to COVID-19 and climate change, are characterized by being highly interdependent and very complex to mitigate, as they need really multi-stakeholder and multilateral actions to resolve them. But before I start the talk, I'd just like to introduce a short video to help set the scene. So Jess, if you could just move on, please, thanks. Thanks, Jess. We could just move to the next slide. So I hope you got to hear that video. It didn't work for me, but then I'm several thousand miles away. But just talking about the current situation, it won't have escaped your attention that we're in the midst of a healthcare crisis. And it's also an economic crisis, and combined with an energy crisis too. And add to that a looming humanitarian crisis in some emerging economies. And you have just a multitude of challenges, all of which are exacerbated by and exacerbating geopolitical risks. But how do you think these crises will play out over the next 18 months? And what do you think that means for the actions we should take today? So this slide talks to the World Economic Forum COVID-19 Outlook Report, which the Forum published in May this year. And it looks out over a time frame of 2 years, 18 months or 2 years into the future. And it highlighted that economic risks are the most important risks or fallout from the COVID crisis, globally and for businesses, with the top ranked risk being a prolonged global recession. However, many of the other risks in the list highlighted that we have also societal, geopolitical, technological and sustainability implications of COVID-19, not least of all on that last point, how we still need to take actions to tackle that other major existential global risk for humans, climate change. So this COVID crisis and the survey also highlighted the interdependencies of global risks triggered by the COVID-19 pandemic. And made no mistake, we are for sure experiencing an historic event which will change many aspects of the world we live in, including the geopolitics, the economic impact on many industry sectors, the competitive business landscape, as well as the long-term societal impacts, for example, increasing inequality, changes in consumer behaviors, the nature of work, and the role of technology, both at work and at home. So Jess, if we could move to the next slide, please. So one of the most important fallouts for the world of dealing with the global crisis, such as COVID-19, is ignoring other existential global risks. In this case, as I mentioned, the shortfall of activity to address climate change, adaptation, and mitigation. We've already seen a 1-year delay in the COP26 meeting, originally scheduled for November 2020. And this is a really critical meeting at a time when scientists tell us we must act now to halve emissions of greenhouse gases in the next 10 years. New, more ambitious, nationally determined commitments on emissions reductions need to be agreed as soon as possible, as well as an agreement on carbon trading rules, the so-called Article 6 of the Paris Agreement, which is essentially the rule book which will enable widespread carbon pricing, a vital economic tool for controlling emissions. So as countries start to emerge from the immediate health crisis and work on rebooting their economies, it looks like there are divergent trends on the role of sustainability in those rebuilding efforts. And these will create emerging risks of a slowing or multi-speed transition of economies and industries. In some regions, including Europe, the EU, already have a Green Deal in place to align fiscal policies with clean growth. But other countries and regions are focused on delivering an economic rebound through brown stimulus measures. And these include cuts in sustainability investment and weaker commitments to climate and nature action. So looking to a world beyond COVID-19, the Secretary General of the United Nations, Antonio Guterres, reaffirmed the targets for sustainability and our obligations to achieve them. He said, "We have a framework for action, the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, and we have the Paris Agreement on climate change, and we must keep our promises for both people and the planet." So post-COVID-19 changes in our working practices, our attitudes towards traveling, commuting, and consumption just might make it easier to find business opportunities to capitalize on a lower carbon and more sustainable recovery. And this could enable us and society in general to adapt responsibly and return cleaner and greener and develop through sustainable growth with people and communities at the center of our societies. And if there is a silver lining to something as catastrophic as COVID-19, it's the environmental cleansing and the slowdown in greenhouse gas emissions that we experienced in the early part of this year. As industrial output plummeted in response to the economic lockdowns, and as cars disappeared from roads and planes were grounded, I think we all noticed everywhere in the world a positive effect on our surroundings. We could look up at the sky, see that the air was cleaner, the sky was blue, there was less pollution, and nature was beginning to regain control and restore the balance. And statistics back this up. According to the International Energy Agency, global greenhouse gas emissions are predicted to fall by 8% in 2020 compared with 2019. And in early April this year, when the world was pretty much in full lockdown, daily global carbon emissions dropped by 17% compared with the same time last year. However, by early June, as the lockdowns began to ease, the Global Carbon Project reported that we were only about 5% below the figure of emissions for the previous June, indicating a return to the same depressing carbon-intensive recovery trajectory. And worse, it's not simply that we were going back to where we were, but raising the temporary benefits from lockdown. The real danger is that COVID-19 will accelerate climate change by compounding all the risk factors that threaten long-term sustainability. Although it has provided a glimpse of a greener future, COVID-19 underscores the challenge of meeting the UN target to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees centigrade. So even before the pandemic struck, there were concerns about achieving this target. And that was highlighted by a white paper that we produced in Zurich last year called Managing the Impacts of Climate Change. And in it, we noted that while legislation, sentiment, and social trends have shifted in favor of tackling climate change, actions are still falling short of what is needed to sustainably transition the global economy. And if our assessment of global warming, informed by our climate change scorecard, is a reminder of the need for concrete actions as well as good intentions, COVID-19 may well undermine both. We've already seen political resolve weaken in the quest to build back regardless, rather than build back better, with some governments relaxing or suspending environmental protection regulations to stimulate industrial activity. As governments, businesses, and as individuals, we focus on restoring shattered economies and our lives and livelihoods. For many people, that will mean a fight for survival. The brown recovery route may seem like the only practical option, and green now merely a nice to have. The message is clear. Recovery without sustainability would be a big mistake. The gravest environmental fallout for the world is a shortfall of investment in climate action, because it may perpetuate resource-intensive practices and increase greenhouse gas emissions. So Jess, if we could pop to the next slide, please. So is it rational that to believe that we can achieve this 1.5 degree world? And just to emphasize how difficult that task is, and get to the Paris achievement goal of limiting warming to, as it was said, substantially less than 2 degrees. This series of charts on this slide, which are from the 2018 CRO Forum report, The Heat is On, reveal the challenge, I think, in stark and simple terms. On the left of the slide is a chart that shows the rate of acceleration and deceleration of carbon dioxide emissions over the last 150 years, pretty much since the start of the Industrial Revolution. And we can see that the only times that there's been a deceleration in carbon dioxide emissions has been either during economic crises or wars. Overlaid on this, to the right of that historic data, are the residual concentration pathway scenarios used by the climate scientists to illustrate the warming potential of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. The green one, RCP 2.6, is the scenario which is most likely to deliver a 2 degree warming outcome, and the others all lead to much higher warming. And the annual reduction in emissions this year, which was 7% as I mentioned earlier, are the kind of reductions that will need to happen annually for the next 30 years to achieve the Paris Agreement goals. So I think it really illustrates, as it says on the slide, that to achieve this goal requires a massive deceleration in emissions. And that huge effort will need many changes to happen, not just technological changes, but economic drivers implemented, including carbon pricing, the removal of fossil fuel subsidies, as well as social policies put in place to ensure that the just transition preserves livelihoods, jobs, and the local economies. Unfortunately, as the two charts on the right of this slide show, we've been seeing accelerating increases in emissions in recent years, especially in the emerging economies, in part driven by globalization as the OECD nations have basically transferred their carbon-intensive production of products and materials to those economies. The chart on the lower right is kind of like the church tower fund thermometer, if you like, and it shows the rising stock of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere measured in parts per million. And what it's showing is just an inexorable rise of carbon dioxide and greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. And the clock is ticking as it slowly rises to 450 parts per million, the level at which 2 degrees is dialed into global warming. So Jess, next slide, please. So what's our collective appetite for this slowly developing risk? And do we really understand why global warming matters? And so this chart, which is from the same CRO Forum report as the previous one, we illustrate some of the consequences of the different RCP scenarios, residual concentration pathway scenarios, and the global warming impact. And the distribution on the left kind of gives you an insight as to where, given the current economy, global economy, where we think global warming is going to get to. And in essence, it looks like we're moving towards a 3-degree world. And the challenge isn't just that the Earth gets warmer with climate change. It's the way that the Earth stores and releases carbon are episodic. And once these different mechanisms are switched on or off, there's absolutely no easy way to reverse the situation, leading ultimately to a consequence of runaway climate change, a situation where it's already too expensive or just too difficult to stop, and ultimately poses an existential threat to our own existence on this planet. And already, if you look at the column on the right, we're seeing worse floods, wildfires, which we certainly experienced in Australia, windstorms, droughts, and heat waves. We're already seeing glaciers retreat. We're seeing the land ice pack in Greenland and Antarctica melting. And the expectation is by the end of this century, we'll see global sea level rise by at least 2 meters. And add on top of that, significant flooding exacerbated by storm surges of many, many more meters during tropical storms. And you can really start seeing the physical consequences and the physical risks. That's even now. At 2 degrees of warming, the planet is committed to full ice cap melt. And if you've ever been on a beach where you've seen the last sort of raised beaches, which are the beaches which are at the last high stand of sea level where the polar ice caps melted many thousands of years ago, that means a 30-meter of sea level rise. That's not going to happen in the next century, but it will happen over a number of centuries and won't be able to be stopped. So we have to plan and think about that kind of impact. And we do have a chance, if we act now, to preventing that from happening. In the current trajectory, at just over 3 degrees of warming, the biosphere becomes a net emitter of carbon dioxide, and warming accelerates even faster as no carbon is stored. So you can see just how serious the impacts of climate change are. It's not just a gradual warming and you get to go to the beach in a pair of shorts every day in Northern Hemisphere. This is much, much more serious in its physical impacts. So Jess, can we move on to the next slide? So how should we as risk managers think about the risks that climate change brings to our businesses? What are the key risks, and is there a framework we should be thinking about? So the 3 risks are shown on this slide that affect all businesses are the physical risks, which I've talked about, the transition risks, and the litigation risks. The physical risks include all the changes that I've already mentioned. Climate scientists now understand that prolonged periods of heat and cold are the effects that are currently most closely attributable to ongoing global warming. More difficult to model are the chaotic weather systems like tropical storms or convective hailstorms and tornadoes. But many of these systems we know are already strongly affected by multi-decadal processes like the El Nino Southern Oscillation in the Northern Hemisphere and the Indian Ocean Dipole in the Southern Hemisphere, where the interaction between the ocean and the atmosphere influences the weather, leading to either prolonged periods of drought and conditions for wildfires like the ones experienced in Australia and in California at the moment. And the climate change influence on these multi-decadal processes are difficult to understand and model, although most climate scientists agree that the climate change will exacerbate the effects of these processes. And work on natural catastrophe modelling of chaotic severe weather events indicates that tropical storms are likely to become more impactful. We've seen that with recent hurricanes in the western part of the Pacific Basin, with higher wind speeds, greater aerial extent. Typically, the hurricanes will change their normal paths, and when they do hit land, they become more rainstorm flooding events as a consequence of absorbing more moisture whilst they're over the ocean. The transition risks include the impact on assets, financial assets and physical assets of the shift from a high carbon to a low carbon global economy as we attempt to reduce carbon emissions. In every sector, there's going to be winners and losers, creating the risk of stranded assets for investors. For example, these assets might be a physical asset like a fossil fuel reserve, or they may be stranded capital, for example, where a plant or factory doesn't recover its initial investment capital. Or it might be something like stranded revenues, where a business model is no longer viable. I came across a great example of that recently, talking to a private equity firm, which told me that they'd lost 70% of the value of one of their funds from one company, which was a software firm. And you're probably thinking, well, how can that be? How can a software firm be impacted by climate change? But when I tell you that firm was producing control software for thermal coal power plants, an industry in steep decline as a result of the need to reduce carbon emissions, and you can immediately see that their revenue model had fallen off a cliff. The third set of risks refer to litigation. And now there's been a long history of litigation on climate change, particularly in the US, but in many other jurisdictions as well, that stretches back at least 20 years. And there's many novel legal approaches being developed as both the plaintiffs and their lawyers try to pin the responsibility for climate change on carbon-intensive sectors. So far, these challenges have come to naught in the courts, but it's an ever-changing world, and there's new legal approaches and new scientific evidence coming to light every day. So we must keep very aware of that risk as well. So Jess, we can move to the next slide. So Trevor mentioned in his introduction the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, and I think it's true that every company in every sector has a role to play in this, and no one is immune from these climate change risks, whether they're physical or transition or litigation. But fortunately, the frameworks that are around are very helpful, especially the TCFD, the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosures. Many of you will already be applying some of those frameworks in your own organizations and perhaps contributing to one of the 4 key pillars for your company's own analysis. So the first of the 4 pillars is the governance framework. In other words, how your board and your management teams understand climate change and act accordingly. The second pillar covers the strategy framework, which is largely about deploying scenario analysis, which is something pretty familiar to many risk managers who need to quantify risk. Though for climate change, the challenge is to model these changes over a much longer time frame than usual, not just the typical 3 to 5 year time horizon of a business plan or strategy that may lead to an analysis of either solvency or capital modeling. But for climate, the scenarios need to be out over 10, 20 or even 30 years to match the time over which the physical risks of climate change begin to take hold. And that creates all sorts of other modeling challenges about how you would think about modeling a business over that time, and whether you, for example, take a fixed balance sheet approach or whether you take a variable balance sheet approach, and how would you even set assumptions about how economic factors are going to vary over that time. So the third pillar is really one about risk management. And this is about making choices about how you apply the scenarios to your business portfolios. And what risk models and metrics you would choose to describe climate risk. For example, is climate risk a standalone risk, which you treat with its own metrics, for example, like a climate value at risk? Or is it just a set of inputs to the existing models in your risk taxonomy and metrics, your operational risk, for example, or your credit or your market risks? And finally, once you've done that analysis to understand the impact of climate change risk on your business, what will you do about it? And that needs to be captured back in the strategy pillar too. And eventually, your actions, as you choose to describe them to your stakeholders, need to be disclosed in the final pillar of the framework, the financial metrics and measures. After all, the F in TCFD stands for financial disclosures. So Jess, we can just move on to the next one. So what about regulation? Well, ever since the Paris Agreement, COP21, the politicians have been trying to pressure different industries to change. And the financial services industry is one of the first places they looked at. Initially through the G20 finance ministers, who got together immediately after COP21, and they viewed climate risk pretty much as a systemic financial risk, similar to the risk they experienced in the 2008 credit crisis. So they turned to the Financial Stability Board to ask them to develop an approach which led to the framework that I've just described, the TCFD. And so far, the TCFD has been voluntary, but increasingly regulators and supervisors in the financial services industry have been looking to incorporate climate change risk into regulation. And in March last year, the Bank of England Prudential Regulation Authority issued their new supervisory statement 0319, which was the first supervisory statement of regulation globally, which mandated regulated firms to do two things. One, to establish a senior management function for climate change, in other words, a senior person on your executive team to be responsible for understanding and communicating the impacts of climate change, and for firms to calculate the climate risk impact on their portfolio, a complicated and difficult task, which no one really knows how to do, but which the Bank of England set up the Climate Financial Risk Forum of about 40 market participants to come up with some handbooks, which are just recently published this summer, that describe at least how to make a start on that process. And in the insurance sector, the International Association of Insurance Supervisors, supported by the Sustainability Insurance Forum, the SIF is led by Jeff Summerhays, who heads up APRA in Australia, has issued 2 papers on the topic of climate change. And regulators around the world have either issued communications or papers or expectations in the market for climate risk. That includes EIOPA in Europe, the Monetary Authority of Singapore, Japan FSA, and in Europe, BaFin in Germany, and many others. So I think the expectation is in the next couple of years, there's a very strong likelihood there's going to be more supervisors and regulators following the Bank of England's example and actually implementing this in mandatory regulation. So Jess, if you can move to the last slide. So what exactly is this opportunity to build back better? And what are we doing in Zurich about this? But it's clear that unless we build a green stimulus into all our COVID-19 recovery plans, both in business and at country level, we'll all suffer the long-term consequences. Now it's the wrong moment to slow the momentum for carbon pricing or to ease up on the removal of fossil fuel subsidies. Nor must we be diverted from developing cleaner and more efficient forms of energy, nor should we lose enthusiasm for the investments that promote sustainability. In fact, now is the time to redouble all our green efforts. And from a business perspective, it's hard for companies to generally be successful in societies that are not functioning well. And we know that societies are increasingly impacted, both economically, societally, and other ways from COVID-19. And this is where stakeholder capitalism has a role to play. Businesses need to bring all our skills and assets to help invest in a better society. And we see this really clearly in the challenges climate change brings, where we have to bring the best of all sectors, both public and private, to bear on these problems. And at Zurich, we have a wide range of initiatives to ensure we stay focused on this threat. We were the first insurer last year to commit to the UN Global Compact 1.5 degree centigrade ambition, and we're vigorously pursuing our own carbon reduction strategy. We're also developing new products and services to help our customers manage the physical and transition risks and build resilience. And on the investment side, we've been a founding member last year, in fact, it's the first year anniversary of the Net Zero Asset Owners Alliance, a climate leadership group whose members have pledged to reduce the carbon emissions of their investment portfolios, which are now over $5 trillion, to net zero by 2050, essentially through engagement with investee companies in organizations like the CA100 plus, the top carbon intensive companies in the world, and through sector and asset management engagement. And in Zurich's own risk management, we're modeling our own risks, and through our risk engineering function, we're bringing to our customers our industry-leading accumulation and natural catastrophe modeling capabilities to create adaptation opportunities and understand the evolving exposure to your physical assets. Finally, as a large global insurer with operations in over 60 countries around the world, we are influential with policymakers, governments, and we play our part in supporting our customers and their sectors and influencing changes in economic policies and social policies that help support new business models which are lower carbon and therefore managing the transition risks. So just to conclude, we do have cause for optimism, but how we get out of this COVID-19 crisis is deeply concerning. We need to focus not only on a healthcare solution, but a recovery that's focused on climate, sustainability, and on societal risk too. We do have a chance at a clean, green, and sustainable recovery that allows growth to return, with people and communities at the center of our efforts. As responsible businesses, we must grab this chance with both hands and help society to adapt and come back better. So Trevor, that's it from me. I wonder if we can just maybe head into a Q&A session now.
Absolutely, and thank you, John. That was a fantastic presentation. We do have one question, and I do really do ask all the participants to throw questions up. We've got a great person here to ask those questions. So I will just throw the first question up. John, thank you for the chilling presentation. It seems that at the heart of this poor level of response is a sheer lack of political will in some quarters. Is more being done to get these climate skeptics to accept the blindingly obvious?
Yes, it's a huge challenge politically, and it's not straightforward. I mean, what we've seen in the last 4 years is really a rise of nationalist and populist politicians around the world, and in some cases autocracies. And it's those kind of politicians for which long-term risks like climate change are less popular. Quite frankly, some of these leaders are climate skeptics. They believe this is some kind of conspiracy theory, some kind of attack on their economies or their societies. But as you can see from the science, and I think this is with COVID-19, this is really interesting, that I saw a fantastic placard actually at a protest last year. I think it was one of the Extinction Rebellion protests, which it said something like, every disaster movie starts with a scientist telling the government the world is about to have a disaster, and they're ignored. And I think that's so true. It's like with COVID and with climate risk, and I think with a lot of global risks, weapons of mass destruction, some of the technological risks of biotechnology and artificial intelligence, that the experts, the scientists, will know, who understand these things really well, try to explain to the politicians what the situation is. But politicians, for their own purposes, often either change the message or ignore the message. And we've seen that with COVID. The World Health Organization tried really hard to communicate to many countries around the world what should be done around preparing with equipment, with PPE, with ventilators, for example, for COVID, and with policies around controlling the spread of the disease. But in many countries, those are ignored for all sorts of reasons, and we've now got the pandemic that we're living through at the moment. And I think with climate change, it's exactly the same. So I think this is where the private sector has a big role to play. We can't, as a private sector, change politicians, but what we can do is we can talk to our customers, we can talk to our employees, we can work with those people in cities or in states or with governments who want to make these changes happen and will support them in a kind of coalition of the willing. And I think in that way, we can actually show people that we can make these changes to economies. It won't be easy, but getting to a net zero carbon world is possible. We have many of the technologies. It's about creating the economic drivers and the social drivers to enable that to happen.
Excellent. I've got a question here. John, thank you for the presentation. Would you be able to share an example of a transition risk relating to technology?
Yes, so there's many actually. There's spoiled for choice here, but so coal is an interesting one, and obviously it's an important topic for Australia, given the coal-based the size of the coal-based sector within the Australian economy. But it's true also in Europe, for especially the countries like Poland, the Czech Republic, and Eastern Germany. When you look at the challenge, and thinking back to that chart I showed of the concentration of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere and the acceleration of carbon emissions, and you look at where those carbon emissions are coming from, in the power and energy sector, the vast majority of emissions are coming from thermal coal power stations. And quite frankly, right now, if you look at the total installed base of thermal coal power plants around the world, and a lot of those are actually now in Asia, especially the new ones. I think the average age of the thermal coal power fleet in Asia is around 14 years. So typically these assets will last for 30 years plus. So you can kind of see the challenge. We've already built in an expectation for how many tons of carbon dioxide we're going to emit. And we really, when you do that calculation and you look at the 450 parts per million carbon dioxide concentration, it gets you to 2 degrees. You just realize that you can't build any more of these plants. So there has to be a moratorium on building more thermal coal plant. But then what do? What do we replace them with? And ideally, we should be replacing these plants quickly with lower carbon alternatives. In many cases, that will be renewables, either wind or solar. But wind or solar doesn't work in every country. Japan, for example, with hurricanes and typhoons and earthquakes and tsunamis, it's pretty difficult to protect the offshore wind plants and even solar onshore. So what's the alternative? Well, they're now looking at low carbon fuels like hydrogen. There's many ways to produce hydrogen. Well, two main ways: so-called blue hydrogen, which is steam methane reforming, a chemical process that produces a lot of carbon dioxide. And if you store that carbon dioxide within a carbon capture and storage system, you essentially have a low carbon supply of hydrogen. The other alternative method of production is green hydrogen, which is using off-peak renewable energy to electrolyze seawater to produce hydrogen. The Japanese are looking at both of these options. They're talking with both projects in Australia and in the Middle East to either use coal bed methane or methane from natural gas to reform and produce hydrogen. And they've already got tenders out on liquid hydrogen tankers to transport hydrogen from either Australia or the Middle East to Japan, just as they have done or developed over the last 30 years the LNG industry to make the best use of the so-called, at that time, stranded assets in the Northwest Shelf of Australia or in the Middle East of large amounts of gas. So coming back to coal, the transition risk is we've got to stop producing coal and replacing it with these lower carbon alternatives. But of course, if you look at Australia or if you look at those countries I mentioned in Eastern Europe or Central Europe, what do we do with the jobs that if we shut down those industries, the coal industry? And it's not just the jobs in the mines or the thermal coal power plant production. It's all the related jobs in the connected economy and local economy around those activities, the local shop that provides the sandwiches for the workers, everything. And so in Europe, as part of the new Green Deal, actually what's been set aside is a pretty large transition budget to actually support the workers in those sectors and the governments in those countries to actually develop alternative industries to help people with early retirement, with retraining for the younger workers, and to enable the transition in that way. It's already been done very effectively in some countries like Spain, who've effectively completely shut down their coal mining industry. And you know, if we don't do it, what we'll see is rather what we saw as a consequence of globalization over the last 30 years in the developed economies of sort of Rust Belt communities where people feel completely left behind and are unemployed not just for one generation, but 2 or 3 or more generations, with all the social ills that come with that.
Just a slight as aside, do you then see like Joe Biden with his green initiative reframing it as job creation? Do you see that as a positive way of combating that?
Yes, I think that is a good way of doing. But equally, on the other side of the political spectrum, you could claim you're maintaining jobs if you keep the coal industry going. So it works both ways. I think the best thing is just to be straight with people and say, look, this requires economic drivers and support or subsidy, but we've just got to reframe the subsidy framework. Instead of supporting carbon intensive activities with subsidies, we have to subsidize the low carbon activities.
Thank you. The next question, because there's a few coming in, I'll try to get to as many as I can. Aside from the reporting, what can companies practically do to both push the climate change agenda and minimize their own impacts? So there's a number of things you can do. You know, people often ask me this. I think on a really practical level, you need to get engaged with your organizations to help them understand climate risks, integrate that into your enterprise risk management framework, and help inform your business about what the strategic options are. And sometimes this will be really dramatic. It might mean your company, your organization may need to sort of completely change your strategy and develop a new business model. We've seen that very recently in some of the oil and gas companies, especially in Europe. Shell 2 years ago came up with a completely different model. They're going to move from being an international oil company to an integrated energy company. Total, Repsol, Equinor, and most recently BP have got exactly the same plans. So that's a pretty brave, you know, if you think of your career as a risk manager, that's probably one of the biggest impacts you can have on your business, you know, overseeing and helping to drive and integrate the analysis and the thinking that leads to a completely new business. You know, that's really putting your head above the parapet. But I think in more, think back to the 3 risks that I talked about: the physical risks, the transition risks, and the litigation risks. I think on the physical risks, you could do some really practical things with understanding the exposure of your physical risk assets, especially those on coastal areas, which are becoming much more prone to storm surge flooding and just to flooding in general. And to think about how do you build that resilience in. And so it's not just your normal risk engineering sort of exposure analysis on an individual site or on a portfolio of your physical assets, but actually thinking about how does climate change likely to change that in the next 5 years or 10 years? And would you choose to either protect an existing brownfield site in your portfolio to take account of those changing physical risks, or actually looking forward when you build new plant or new facilities, new distribution centers, for example, would you build them somewhere else? And I think that's a really interesting, very practical opportunity. And at Zurich, we're just launching this month a service which essentially helps people do exactly that, where we've taken our natural catastrophe modeling team's understanding of climate change and actually built that in with our risk engineering team's ability to deliver that kind of analysis for you. Fantastic. I'd love to know more about that. The next question: Australia's power grid is still very much reliant on coal, whilst power companies are transitioning to more renewable forms of energy. Many insurers are threatening to walk away from these clients, even though they can't realistically shut down the coal-fired power stations very quickly. Is there not a better way to engage in dialogue specifically to each country rather than applying a set standard globally?
Yeah, and that's essentially the Paris Agreement is based on nationally determined reduction commitments. So it's not a global agreement. I mean, when that's why it took 21 years, actually more than 21 years, to get to the Paris Agreement, because I think essentially what people were trying to do in all that time post Kyoto, and that's what the COP meetings are, because the committees are the parties that signed the Kyoto Agreement. It took them all that time to come up with a globally binding greenhouse gas emissions agreement, because it's politically almost impossible, because there's all the arguments of the developing economies saying, look, you developed nations emitted all the carbon dioxide during the Industrial Revolution to the present day. We want to develop now. It takes energy. The technologies to produce energy are carbon intensive. You can't stop us from developing. I mean, it wouldn't be, that's a kind of human right to do that. And therefore, if you want us to stop doing that, you must help subsidize that growth, that low carbon growth. And that's kind of, in very simple terms, what stymied the global greenhouse gas emissions agreement. But what broke the logjam, which credit to the French, they spent a couple of years of very strong global diplomacy to get the G20 nations to basically say, look, it's up to us. We need to decide. We need to explain to everybody else we're the biggest emitters what our emissions reduction commitment should be. And so every country has done that. I think at COP26, as I mentioned, it's really important to strengthen those commitments. Otherwise, we're not going to achieve, because you add up all the nationally determined reduction commitments, they don't get you to 2 degrees. They get you to more like 3 degrees, which, as I showed on one of my earlier slides, you're in a bad place if you get to that level of warming. So we've got to accelerate that. In part, I think it's about creating the right economic incentives. If you think about it from a business perspective, you go to your board and say, oh, I'm going to wring my hands, and John told me about all these terrible things that are going to happen with climate change, and we really should do something about it. And some boards will go, yeah, you're right, we should, and just take a leap of faith and change their business models. But it's an awful lot easier if we recognize the value of carbon, the true value of carbon in a carbon trading or pricing mechanism. And in that way, we all as businesses suddenly realize continuing with a carbon intensive activity is just too expensive. It doesn't make economic sense. We'd have to pay too much tax, or a levy, or a border tax to transport carbon intensive goods or energy or services. And so I think that Article 6 in COP, the next COP meetings, is absolutely critical to get right. And of course, it's very, very difficult to implement, because it's like the whole trade war discussion that's going on at the moment, most notably between China and the US, but between all nations. It's a method of national competition to see how much tariff you can base on all sorts of trade, not least of all the carbon intensive trade. So I think focusing on those economic changes are really, I think, the thing that's going to break the logjam. And from a consumer point of view, if you have to pay more for something and there's a cheaper alternative, you'll go for that cheaper alternative, especially if it's, in your eyes, better. And in this case, better because it's lower carbon.
Yeah. I suppose, just as an aside, do you then see the insurance industry taking a stand and, say, applying additional premium like they do for ACP or EPS?
So I think the insurance industry has some interesting levers to play in this. I think there's 4, really. I think one is around investments, another one is around underwriting, the third is around risk management, and the fourth one is around policy influencing. So we'll take each one and try and explain what we can do with each one. So in investments, and I mentioned earlier that we joined this thing called the Net Zero Asset Owners Alliance, which is essentially pension funds and asset owners like insurers, rather than the big managed funds like BlackRock and those sorts of companies. So people who actually own the assets rather than manage them on behalf of other people. It's really important to sort of think, what can you do? And this applies to underwriting as well. So if you want to influence people to change what they do, you can do a couple of things. You can say to them, okay, I don't agree with what you're doing. Let me explain to you why I think that. And by the way, if you don't change what you're doing, I'm just going to stop supporting you. I'm not going to invest in you and provide capital, or I'm not going to underwrite you. The challenge with that is that it's like any negotiation. When you walk away from the negotiation, you lose any influencing power. And the reality is, in financial markets, there's always somebody else who will provide some capital somewhere in the financial system. So in essence, with a divestment approach or an exclusionary approach, except at the margins with things like really obvious things like thermal coal, that all you do is you don't do anything. You just raise the issue and then walk away. So you're not really helping. So I think really the focus is about practical engagement, talking with people and saying, look, these are the issues. We see it as the insurance industry because we see these severe physical effects beginning to take place. Yes, we will build that immediately into our pricing, and that's what we experience in the market today. It's a competitive market, the insurance market, so you see that kind of price. But I think the really interesting thing is this discussion with regulators, because the regulators, pushed by the politicians who don't really understand, I believe, how financial markets work, and especially insurance, are kind of pushing to a point where they're saying, look, you should build in climate risk into your solvency or capital models. So if you do that, and bear in mind I said these risks take place over decades. If you build in something that might happen in 20 years' time into your capital model that says I need to hold more capital, well, I need to price my products higher because a component of the pricing of the product is the cost of the capital we apply to it. But what would that do? Well, if you did it as an individual company, essentially you'd be pricing yourself out of the marketplace. You'd be adding price to a product which the other competitors wouldn't be adding, and so you'd just be out of the game. If a regulator demanded everybody in all insurers in an industry or in a country raise their prices in that way by applying more capital, then I think what happens is insurance just becomes too expensive and people won't buy it. And then you're in an even worse place because people are not protected then, and you just decrease the protection gap, not decrease it. So I don't think that works either. So I think that the message back to regulators at the moment is just be careful what you wish for. Yes, we want to use the financial levers to encourage change, but let's just figure out how best to do that. And I think engagement is the way to do it. Engagement not only with individual companies in the carbon intensive sectors, but across whole sectors and across whole value chains. It's no good going to an oil and gas company and saying you've got to stop producing oil and gas if that company hasn't had a discussion with their energy customers, the OEMs who produce long distance trucks or planes or trains or ships, or the engine manufacturers that manufacture the engines and the fuel, the type of fuel those engines use, because you have to do that all the way along the value chain. And then, by the way, you've got to talk with the end users, the distribution companies who buy those modes of transport to distribute goods. And you've also got to talk to governments to say, look, you've got to incentivize, either by subsidy or by tax breaks or any other way, these changes in the whole supply chain of fuel and low carbon fuels and the transport systems that use them. So I think it's a pretty complicated transition, but unless we tackle these things straight on, I think the financial services sector, insurance included, through our investment, our underwriting, I mentioned the risk management type services we can support you guys with on the physical assets, and that final piece of influencing governments through policy, then that's what we have to do.
Cool. Well, we're just coming towards the end of the session, and I'm just about to hand us over to the president of RIMS Australasia to close out the summit. But I did just have one last question, if I get a quick response from you. What are the observations of different generations dealing with climate change? Is it true younger generations care more about climate change than older generations?
I think we all care, but if you're young, you're going to live longer, obviously, and you have to deal with the consequences. And I think, if we don't fix the problem now, as I said, it's either going to be too expensive or just practically impossible to stop climate change from happening. So we all owe it to our children, our grandchildren, our great-grandchildren to fix the problem now.